In a town ruled by God and gossip, a woman's reputation was everything, and Grace Hamilton's was hanging by a thread. She worked in her father's trading post, a place that kept the town alive with flour and blankets, but poisoned it with whispers and liquor. The bar in the back was a stain on her name, a place for rough men with rough habits, and every clink of a glass was another mark against her. They watched her, the good people of the town, their eyes colder than the winter wind whipping outside. They judged the way she handled the bottles, the way she counted the money, the way she simply existed in a space they deemed unfit for a proper woman. That night, the whispers felt louder. The wind howled like a hungry wolf, and inside, the laughter from the bar felt like a personal attack. Grace stacked flour sacks, the weight in her arms nothing compared to the weight on her soul. She had to get out, not just out of the trading post, but out of this town, out of this life that was slowly suffocating her. She didn't have a plan. She didn't have a destination. All she had was a desperate, burning need to escape. As she moved through the store, her hands trembling, a voice cut through the noise. It came from the bar, slurred and ugly. "That Hamilton girl, not the kind you bring home to Mama." Laughter erupted, sharp and cruel. It was the final push. The world narrowed to that sound, that insult. Grace dropped the sack of flour, a cloud of white dust exploding at her feet like a ghost. She turned, her face a mask of stone, and walked toward the back door. She didn't grab her heavy coat. She didn't grab a scarf. She just opened the door and stepped out into the blizzard. The cold hit her like a physical blow, stealing the air from her lungs. But it was better than the suffocating judgment inside. She pulled her thin shawl tight and plunged into the blinding white chaos of the storm, leaving the whispers and the laughter far behind. She had no idea she was running straight into a nightmare worse than any gossip. The snow wasn't just falling, it was a wall of white, a living thing that wanted to swallow her whole. Every direction looked the same. The wind screamed in her ears, tearing at her cloak, biting at any exposed skin. Panic, cold and sharp, began to creep into her heart. She had thought the town was a prison, but this was a tomb. She tried to turn back to find her own footprints, but the storm had already erased them. There was no path. There was no sound but the wind. She was utterly, terrifyingly lost. Then the ground gave way. A crack, like a gunshot, echoed under her feet. She was on a frozen creek hidden by the snow. The ice splintered and she fell hard, her hands scraping raw against the jagged surface. A searing pain shot up her leg, her ankle, twisted, broken. She didn't know. She only knew the agony was blinding. She scrambled to her feet, trying to put weight on it, and collapsed with a cry that was stolen by the wind. The cold was no longer just on her skin. It was in her bones, in her blood. It was a poison, seeping into every part of her, dragging her down. Her strength faded. The will to fight drained away. Her last thought wasn't of the town or her father or the whispers. It was just a single, overwhelming feeling of surrender. The world dissolved into a blur of swirling white, and then nothing. The storm howled around her, a final, mocking lullaby as her world faded to black. Inside his cabin, miles from anyone, Caleb Mason added another log to the fire. He was a man who had made a pact with solitude. The world outside his door was a world he'd left behind long ago. He preferred the company of the wind and the trees. But tonight, the wind carried something else. A sound, so faint he almost missed it. A cry. Human. He froze, listening. It couldn't be. No one came out this far, especially not in a blizzard like this. He told himself it was the wind playing tricks, a branch scraping against the roof. But then he heard it again, sharper this time. A thin thread of desperation woven into the storm's roar. Against every instinct that told him to stay inside, to keep the world out, he grabbed his heavy coat and lantern. The door groaned open, and the storm lunged at him, a physical force of ice and fury. He stepped out into the white hell. The lantern's light was pathetic, a tiny, flickering star in an ocean of darkness. He pushed forward, leaning into the wind, shouting into the gale. "Hello? Is anyone there?" Only the wind answered. He followed the direction of the sound, a ghost of a memory now. His boots sank deep into the snow, each step a monumental effort. Doubt began to creep in. Maybe he had imagined it. Maybe he was just a lonely man hearing voices in the wind. He was about to turn back when his lantern beam caught something, a dark shape against the snow, a crumpled heap. He rushed forward, his heart pounding in his chest. It was a woman. He knelt, brushing the snow from her face. Her skin was a ghostly white, her lips a terrifying shade of blue. He pressed his fingers to her neck, searching for a pulse. For a heart-stopping second, there was nothing. Then, a faint, thready flutter. She was alive, barely. Without a second thought, he scooped her into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, a fragile weight against the storm's fury. The trek back was a brutal fight. The wind tried to rip her from his grasp. The snow tried to trip his feet. His muscles screamed, his lungs burned. But he held on, his jaw set. He wasn't just carrying a stranger. He was carrying a life, and for reasons he couldn't explain, it felt like the most important thing he'd ever done. He burst back into the cabin, slamming the door against the storm. He laid her gently by the fire, peeling away her frozen shawl. He wrapped her in his thickest blankets, rubbing her hands, trying to force life back into them. "Stay with me," he muttered, his voice rough. He coaxed spoonfuls of warm water between her blue lips. For hours, he was a silent guardian, feeding the fire, watching the faint rise and fall of her chest. As the first hints of dawn painted the windows gray, her eyelids fluttered. She was alive. And Caleb Mason, the man who wanted nothing to do with the world, felt a wave of relief so powerful it almost brought him to his knees. He had saved her. He had no idea he had just destroyed her. Grace woke to the smell of wood smoke and the blessed feeling of warmth. A fire crackled in a stone hearth, casting flickering shadows on rough-hewn log walls. Her body ached, a deep, throbbing pain centered in her ankle, but she was alive. Then she saw him. He was sitting in a chair across the small room watching her. A mountain of a man with broad shoulders and a face that looked like it had been carved from the same wilderness that nearly claimed her. His eyes were dark and unreadable. "You're lucky I found you," he said. His voice was a low rumble, like rocks grinding together. He placed a steaming mug on a small table beside the cot she was lying on. Grace tried to sit up, but a wave of dizziness washed over her, and she fell back with a groan. Where am I?" she whispered, her throat raw. "My cabin," he answered, his expression unchanging. "You were half frozen in the snow. Another hour and you'd have been dead." The bluntness of his words sent a new chill through her, one that had nothing to do with the cold. She was in a strange man's cabin, alone, unchaperoned. The full weight of her situation crashed down on her. Back in town, this was a death sentence for a woman's reputation. She was ruined, utterly and completely ruined. "I have to leave," she stammered, trying to push herself up again, ignoring the sharp protest from her ankle. "I need to go back." The man shook his head, a slow, deliberate movement. "Not in this storm, you don't. The snow's still coming down. You'd be dead before you got a mile." He wasn't being cruel, just stating a fact. The finality in his voice was terrifying. She was trapped. She glanced at the single window, a small square of glass showing nothing but a swirling vortex of white. Then she looked back at the silent man watching her. He hadn't asked her name. He hadn't asked how she ended up in the middle of a blizzard. He just watched. "Thank you," she said, the words feeling small and inadequate. He gave a short, sharp nod, his gaze softening almost imperceptibly. "Rest," he said. You'll need your strength." His words sounded like a simple kindness, but to Grace they felt like a warning. Strength for what? To face the storm? Or to face what came after? A new kind of fear began to bloom in her chest. She had escaped the town, but she had fallen into a different kind of trap, one with no walls and a single, silent keeper. Days passed in a blur of pain and fevered sleep. The storm raged outside, a constant howling reminder of her isolation. Caleb, as she learned his name was a quiet, almost ghostly presence. He tended to her sprained ankle with a rough but gentle skill, brought her broth and water, and kept the fire roaring. He rarely spoke. The silence in the small cabin was a heavy blanket, thick with unspoken questions. Grace learned to read the small shifts in his expression, the way his jaw tightened when he looked out at the storm, the brief flicker of something unreadable in his eyes when he looked at her. He was a man wrapped in secrets, and she was his unwilling guest. She knew nothing about him except that he had saved her life. But as the storm began to ease, a new and more terrifying reality began to set in. The whispers of the town seemed to reach her even here, in this isolated cabin. What would they say when she returned? A young, unmarried woman, spending days and nights alone with a strange man in the wilderness. The truth wouldn't matter. They would see only sin. The day the storm finally broke, the world outside was blindingly bright, covered in a pristine blanket of white. Caleb stood by the door, his rifle slung over his shoulder. "I'll take you back," he said. It wasn't a question. The journey was a slow, agonizing trek through the deep snow. Caleb walked ahead, clearing a path, his silence as unyielding as the frozen landscape. When the first rooftops of the town appeared in the distance, Grace's stomach clenched into a tight, cold knot. She wasn't going home. She was walking to her own execution. They entered the main street, and it was as if a spell had been cast. Conversation stopped, heads turned, doors creaked open as people peered out. Every eye was on her, on the rough-looking man walking beside her. The whisper started instantly, a low, venomous hiss that spread like wildfire. She was with him. Alone? For days. The words were like stones, pelting her, shaming her. She kept her eyes fixed on the ground, her face burning, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm of humiliation. They reached her father's trading post. He was standing behind the counter, his face pale, his eyes hollow. He looked at Grace, then at Caleb, and a muscle jumped in his clenched jaw. The few customers in the store fell silent, watching, waiting. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" her father asked, his voice low and trembling with a mixture of fear and anger. Grace opened her mouth to explain, to tell him what happened, but he held up a hand, shaking his head. "It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what the truth is. People will believe what they want to believe." His gaze shifted to Caleb, scrutinizing the silent man who stood like a stone statue beside his daughter. "What kind of man lets this happen?" he demanded, his voice cracking. Caleb didn't flinch. His dark eyes met her father's. "The kind who kept her alive," he said, his voice even and cold. The words hung in the air, a stark and simple truth that no one wanted to hear. Grace felt the weight of every stare, every judgment. She wanted the floor to open up and swallow her. Her father let out a long, shuddering breath, the fight seeming to drain out of him. His shoulders slumped. He looked old, defeated. "There's only one way to fix this," he said, his voice barely a whisper, filled with a terrible resignation. He looked from Grace to Caleb, his eyes pleading. "You two will have to marry." The words hit Grace like a physical blow. Marry? Marry this stranger, this silent, brooding man from the wilderness? It was a life sentence. Her future, her dreams, everything vanished in that single, horrifying moment. She looked at Caleb, expecting to see shock or anger or refusal, but his expression was calm, his gaze steady as it met hers. "If it'll save your name," he said quietly, his voice devoid of any emotion, "we'll do it." There was no hesitation, no argument, just a quiet, unnerving acceptance. Grace's world tilted on its axis. She was being traded, her life bartered away to salvage a reputation that was already in tatters. She looked at her father's desperate face, at the smug, watching eyes of the townsfolk. She had no choice. She was trapped. Again. With a trembling hand, she nodded, sealing her fate. The wedding was a ghost of a ceremony. It took place in the small, cold church at the edge of town, attended by a handful of people who came not to celebrate, but to witness the final act of Grace's public shaming. Grace wore a borrowed dress, too tight in the shoulders, its faded lace a mockery of bridal purity. Caleb stood beside her in a stiff, unfamiliar suit, looking as out of place as a wolf in a sheep pen. The preacher's words about love and devotion were hollow, echoing in the heavy, judgmental silence of the church. Grace didn't hear them. She was numb. She felt Caleb's large, calloused hand take hers. It was surprisingly warm. When it was his turn to speak the vows, his voice was low and steady, a stark contrast to the storm of emotions raging inside her. As he said the words, "I, Caleb, take thee, Grace," their eyes met for a fleeting second. And in that moment, she saw something that wasn't pity or duty. It was something deeper, something she couldn't name. Respect, maybe. Or a shared understanding of being an outcast. It was a flicker of connection so unexpected it startled her. When the preacher pronounced them man and wife, there was no joyous applause, only a few polite coughs and the shuffling of feet. The attendees dispersed quickly, their whispers following them out into the cold air. Grace and Caleb stepped out of the church, not as a happy couple, but as two strangers bound together by scandal. He helped her onto his wagon, and they began the long, silent journey back to the cabin. Back to their new life, a life neither of them had chosen. The cabin, which had been her shelter, now felt like her prison. The first few weeks were an exercise in silent endurance. They moved around each other like ghosts, the small space crackling with unspoken tension. Caleb spent his days outside, hunting, chopping wood, doing anything to be away from the cabin. Grace spent her days inside, cleaning, cooking, trying to carve out a space for herself in this life that had been forced upon her. She was his wife, but she felt like his prisoner. One afternoon, driven by a desperate need for air, for space, she ventured further from the cabin than she ever had before. She found a small frozen waterfall, a beautiful secret place hidden in the woods. As she stood there watching the ice glitter in the weak sunlight, she felt a glimmer of something she hadn't felt in weeks. Peace. But the peace was shattered when Caleb appeared, moving through the trees as silently as a shadow. "You shouldn't be out here alone," he said, his voice sharp. "It's not safe." "I can take care of myself," she retorted, the frustration of the past weeks boiling over. "I'm not a child." "This isn't town, Grace," he said, his eyes dark and serious. "The woods have their own rules, their own dangers." He gestured for her to follow him back to the cabin. As they walked, she noticed something she hadn't before. He was constantly scanning the trees, his hand never far from the hilt of the large knife on his belt. It wasn't the casual awareness of a woodsman. It was the sharp, honed vigilance of a man who was expecting trouble. The fear she'd felt in the storm returned, but this time it was different. It wasn't fear of the wilderness. It was fear of what the wilderness was hiding. Or who. That night, she couldn't sleep. The silence of the cabin felt different, charged with a new kind of menace. Caleb lay on his cot across the room, a still, dark shape in the moonlight. Was he her protector, or was he the danger she needed protection from? The line between savior and captor had blurred, and Grace was trapped right in the middle. Days bled into one another. each one marked by the same heavy silence. Grace felt like a ghost haunting the edges of Caleb's life. He would disappear for hours, returning with game for their meals, his face grim, his silence a wall she couldn't penetrate. She began to notice things. The way he would sometimes stop mid-chop, listening to the forest, his head cocked as if hearing something she couldn't. The way he meticulously checked the lock on the cabin door every single night, not just once, but 2 or 3 times. He wasn't just living in the wilderness, he was hiding in it. One evening, a brutal ice storm hit. The world outside turned into a treacherous glass sculpture. A massive branch, heavy with ice, crashed onto the roof, splintering wood and tearing a gaping hole above their heads. Icy wind and snow poured into the cabin. For the first time, the wall between them shattered. "Help me!" Caleb yelled over the roar of the wind, dragging a heavy table under the hole. They had to work together. For hours they fought the storm side by side. He braced beams while she stuffed rags and blankets into the gaps. Her hands were raw, her body shaking from cold and exhaustion. At one point, her frustration and fear boiled over. "This isn't easy for me," she snapped, her voice breaking. "I didn't ask for any of this." Caleb stopped, his face inches from hers, his expression stark in the flickering lamplight. "Neither did I," he said, his voice low and raw. The simple, honest words struck her with the force of a physical blow. In that moment, she saw past the silent, intimidating woodsman and saw a man just as trapped by circumstance as she was. The anger between them dissolved, replaced by a shared, unspoken understanding. They had faced the storm together, and something had shifted. Later that night, huddled by the fire, wrapped in blankets, the silence between them was no longer tense. It was companionable. He finally began to talk. He told her about his family, about the fire. He spoke of a happy childhood, of a loving mother and father, of 2 younger siblings he had adored. He described the night of the fire in stark, clipped sentences, his voice devoid of emotion, but his hands were clenched into white-knuckled fists. "I was the only one who made it out," he finished, his gaze fixed on the flames. Grace's heart ached for the boy he had been. "You've been through so much," she said softly. He gave a short, bitter laugh. "You don't know the half of it." Before she could ask what he meant, he stood up, his face closing off again. The wall was back up, but Grace knew now that it wasn't there to keep her out. It was there to keep his own demons in. The next day, while Caleb was out hunting, Grace was cleaning the cabin when she noticed a loose floorboard beneath his cot. Curiosity, sharp and insistent, got the better of her. She pried it up. Underneath was a small, locked wooden chest. Her heart hammered against her ribs. What secrets was he hiding? Using the tip of a knife, she worked at the simple lock until it sprang open. Inside, nestled on a bed of old cloth, was not a weapon or gold, but a collection of heartbreaking treasures. A child's crudely carved wooden horse, its surface worn smooth by small hands. A woman's silver locket, tarnished with age and soot. And a single scorched piece of a family portrait, showing the smiling face of a young boy with Caleb's eyes. She was so absorbed she didn't hear him return. "What are you doing?" His voice was cold as ice. She spun around, guilt and fear warring on her face. He stood in the doorway, his rifle in his hand, his face a thunderous mask. He strode across the room, snatched the chest from her, and slammed the lid shut. "You should not have done that," he said, his voice dangerously low. "These are not for you." He wasn't just angry, he was wounded. The look in his eyes was one of profound betrayal and a deep, bottomless grief. He had shared a piece of his past, and she had stolen the rest. The fragile truce they had built was shattered. He was once again a stranger, and the cabin was once again a prison. And Grace had a terrible feeling that the ghosts he was hiding from were about to come knocking. The cold returned between them, sharper and more painful than before. Caleb was a phantom again. his presence in the cabin a constant, silent accusation. Grace was consumed by guilt. She had violated his trust, unearthing a sorrow he had tried to bury. She tried to apologize, but the words died in her throat whenever she met his cold, distant gaze. He was punishing her with his silence, and it was a torment more effective than any angry words. A week later, the snow had begun to melt, revealing patches of frozen earth. Eager to escape the suffocating atmosphere of the cabin, Grace went to the woodpile at the edge of the clearing to gather firewood. The air was still, the forest quiet. She was bending to pick up a log when a prickle of unease ran down her spine. She felt it before she saw it. Eyes. She straightened up slowly, her heart beginning to pound. And there, at the edge of the trees, it stood. A wolf. Massive, its gray fur ragged, its yellow eyes locked onto hers with a chilling intelligence. It let out a low, guttural growl. From the shadows behind it, two more wolves emerged, their movements sleek and predatory. They weren't just hungry, they were hunting. Panic seized her. She opened her mouth to scream, but only a choked gasp came out. "Caleb!" The sound of his name, thin and desperate, finally broke from her lips. The wolves reacted instantly. They fanned out, their growls deepening, inching closer, cutting off her escape. She backed away, stumbling over a root, her eyes wide with terror. One wolf darted forward, its teeth snapping just inches from her leg. She screamed again, a raw, primal sound of pure fear. The cabin door burst open. Caleb stood there, his face a mask of fury, his rifle already at his shoulder. "Get behind me!" he roared. She didn't hesitate. She scrambled toward him, her breath sobbing in her chest. The world seemed to slow down. The crack of the rifle was deafening, echoing through the silent forest. One of the wolves yelped, a high-pitched cry of pain, and stumbled back. The others hesitated, their predatory confidence broken. Caleb took a step forward, a menacing figure against the snow. "Go on! Get!" he shouted, his voice a command that seemed to shake the very trees. The wolves stared at him for another moment, then turned and melted back into the forest. Grace leaned against the cabin wall, her legs trembling so violently she could barely stand. Caleb turned to her, his face still grim, but the fury in his eyes was replaced by a flicker of concern. "You shouldn't go that far from the cabin alone," he said, his voice softer than she'd heard it in days. "I told you it wasn't safe." She just nodded, unable to speak, her throat tight with residual fear. As he helped her gather the dropped firewood, his hand brushed hers, and the simple contact sent a jolt through her. The wall of silence had been broken by shared terror. Later, as they sat by the fire, the shared danger lingered in the air between them. "They're desperate," Caleb said, staring into the flames. "It's been a hard winter for them, too." But his eyes held a troubled look that told her he wasn't just talking about the wolves. He glanced toward the window, into the deepening twilight. "Something's not right," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "They shouldn't be this bold. They shouldn't be this close." Grace looked at him, then at the dark woods beyond the window. The terrifying thought struck her that the wolves weren't the real danger. They were just a symptom. The real monster was still out there, in the shadows, watching them. And it was getting closer. The incident with the wolves changed things. The fear they had shared acted as a strange kind of glue, mending the fractured trust between them. Caleb started talking again. Not much, but the oppressive silence was gone. He taught her things: how to track, how to tell which berries were safe to eat, how to read the weather in the clouds. He was still guarded, his past still a locked room, but he was letting her see into the hallway. Grace, in turn, found her footing. The cabin began to feel less like a prison and more like a fortress. She planted a small, hardy garden in a patch of earth that caught the most sun. She learned to mend their clothes with a surprising skill. They were building a life piece by piece, out of the wreckage of their old ones. One afternoon, A rider appeared at the edge of the clearing. Both Grace and Caleb froze. It was the first visitor they'd had. The man was burly and coarse-looking, his face flushed from drink. As he got closer, Grace's blood ran cold. It was Silas, the man from the bar in her father's trading post, the one whose cruel words had driven her out into the storm. He reined in his horse, his eyes sweeping over the cabin with a sneer. Then his gaze landed on Grace, and a slow, ugly smile spread across his face. "Well, well, look what we have here. The little lost lamb all shacked up with the big bad wolf." Caleb stepped in front of Grace, his body language radiating quiet menace. "What do you want, Silas?" His voice was flat and cold. "I'm just checking on my property," Silas said, his smile widening. He gestured vaguely at the land around them. "Or what should be my property? This land was promised to my family years ago, before your kind showed up and squatted on it." "This is my land," Caleb said, his voice dangerously low. "My father built this cabin," Silas chuckled, a nasty grating sound. "Your father. Right. The man who got himself and his whole family burned up. A real tragedy." He spat on the ground. The casual cruelty of his words made Grace gasp. Caleb didn't move, but she saw his hands clench into fists at his sides. Silas's eyes shifted back to Grace, his gaze slimy and possessive. "You know, I could have taken care of you, Grace, given you a much better life than this hovel. It's not too late." He started to dismount his horse. That's when Caleb moved. He crossed the space between them in 2 long strides, grabbing the reins of Silas's horse with one hand and Silas's collar with the other. "You will not speak to my wife," he snarled, his voice a low growl of pure fury. "And you will get off my land. Now." He hauled Silas from the saddle, throwing him to the ground with contemptuous ease. Silas landed hard, sputtering in the dirt. He scrambled to his feet, his face purple with rage. "You'll regret this, Mason. This isn't over. This land will be mine, and so will she." He clambered back onto his horse and galloped away, shouting threats over his shoulder. The clearing fell silent. The ugliness of the encounter hung in the air like poison. Grace looked at Caleb. His face was pale, his jaw set like granite. The ghosts he'd been hiding from suddenly had a name, and they had just kicked down the door. "Caleb," she whispered. "What did he mean?" He turned to look at her, and the pain in his eyes was so raw, so deep, it stole her breath. "He meant," Caleb said, his voice rough with emotion, "that the fire that killed my family was no accident. The world seemed to stop. The chirping of the birds, the rustle of the leaves, it all faded away. The only thing Grace could hear was the frantic pounding of her own heart." "What?" she breathed. Caleb turned away from her, his broad shoulders slumping as if under an immense weight. He walked to the edge of the clearing and stared into the woods, his back to her. "Silas's father, Old Man Hemlock, he wanted this land," Caleb began, his voice flat and dead. "My father wouldn't sell. He'd built this cabin with his own hands. This was our home. Hemlock tried everything. Threats, bribes. He tried to run us off." He paused, and Grace could see him swallow hard. "One night we woke up to the smell of smoke. The whole cabin was on fire. My father, he got me out through a window. He told me to run, to hide in the woods and not come back. He went back inside. For my mother and my sisters." His voice broke on the last word. He fell silent for a long time. Grace didn't move, didn't breathe. She was witnessing the unearthing of a wound so deep it had shaped this man's entire existence. "I hid in the woods," he continued, his voice barely a whisper. "I watched it burn. I watched my whole world turn to ash. I heard them screaming." He took a ragged breath. "After, when the sheriff came, Hemlock told everyone it was a terrible accident. A stray ember from the hearth. Everyone believed him. He was a respected man. I was just a boy, hysterical with grief. No one listened to me. So I stayed hidden. I grew up out here, alone. This land is all I have left of them. And now Silas, his father's son, has come back to finish the job. The pieces all clicked into place. His solitude, his vigilance, the deep, inconsolable sadness in his eyes. He wasn't a hermit by choice. He was a survivor in hiding, a silent guardian of his family's grave. Grace walked slowly toward him, her heart aching with a pain that was almost physical. She stopped just behind him and, without thinking, reached out and placed a hand on his arm. He flinched at her touch, but didn't pull away. "You're not alone anymore, Caleb," she said softly. He turned his head, and she saw tears tracking paths through the grime on his face. He had saved her from the storm, and in doing so he had brought his own personal war crashing down upon them both. She knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that this was no longer just his fight. It was theirs. That night, the cabin felt different. It was no longer a prison or a shelter, but a fortress preparing for a siege. They spoke in low tones, a council of two against the world. "He won't give up," Caleb said, cleaning his rifle with meticulous care. "Not now that he knows I'm here, and that you're here." The unspoken threat against her hung in the air. Grace felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. "What will we do?" she asked. "We fight," he said simply. The finality in his voice was both terrifying and comforting. The next day, the sky turned a bruised, angry purple. A storm was rolling in, far more violent than the blizzard that had first brought Grace to Caleb's door. The wind began to howl, and rain started to lash against the windows. They were being cut off, isolated, trapped. As darkness fell, Caleb stood by the window, peering out into the maelstrom. "He'll use the storm as cover," he said, his voice grim. "He'll think we're not expecting him." He was right. A flicker of movement at the edge of the clearing. A lantern quickly extinguished, then another. "How many?" Grace whispered, her hands suddenly clammy. "3," Caleb answered, his eyes never leaving the window. "Silas and 2 others." He turned to her, his face stark in the dim light. "Stay away from the windows. Keep the fire low. When I tell you, you get down." He handed her a small pistol. Her hand trembled as she took it. It was cold and heavy, a terrifying weight of responsibility. "I've never—" she started. "Point and pull the trigger," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "Don't hesitate." The waiting was the worst part. The only sounds were the screaming wind and the frantic beating of her own heart. Then, a loud thud against the door, as if someone had thrown their shoulder against it. Then another. They were trying to break it down. Caleb raised his rifle, aiming it at the door. "Get down!" he yelled. Grace dropped to the floor behind the heavy wooden table, clutching the pistol, her knuckles white. The door splintered, then burst inward with a crash. 3 figures filled the doorway, silhouetted against the stormy night. Silas was in the lead, his face twisted in a triumphant sneer. "Nowhere to run, Mason!" he bellowed over the storm. The crack of Caleb's rifle was deafening in the small space. One of the men with Silas cried out and crumpled to the ground. The other fired back, the bullet splintering the wall just inches from Caleb's head. Caleb dove for cover as Silas and the remaining man rushed into the cabin. It was chaos. The roar of the storm, the shouts of men, the deafening explosions of gunfire. Grace, huddled behind the table, felt a paralyzing fear. This couldn't be real. But the smell of gunpowder and the sight of Silas lunging toward Caleb with a knife was all too real. Caleb kicked out, sending Silas stumbling back. The other man raised his pistol, aiming it straight at Caleb's chest. Time seemed to stop. Caleb was defenseless. Without thinking, without hesitating, Grace raised the pistol she was holding, aimed at the dark shape of the man, and pulled the trigger. The gun bucked in her hand, the sound shockingly loud. The man grunted, a look of surprise on his face, and staggered back, clutching his shoulder. The diversion was all Caleb needed. He launched himself at Silas, and the two men crashed to the floor, a tangle of limbs and fury. Grace scrambled to her feet, her ears ringing, her heart hammering. The wounded man she'd shot was trying to raise his gun again. She didn't think. She grabbed a heavy iron skillet from the hearth and brought it down on his head with all her might. He collapsed without a sound. Caleb and Silas were rolling on the floor, trading brutal punches. Silas was bigger, but Caleb was faster, fueled by years of suppressed rage. With a guttural roar, Caleb gained the upper hand. He pinned Silas to the floor, his forearm pressed against his throat. "You took everything from me," Caleb rasped, his face a mask of grief and fury. "You burned them alive." "They wouldn't leave," Silas choked out, his eyes wide with terror. "The land was ours. My father just wanted what was his." Suddenly another figure appeared in the shattered doorway, a man in a drenched coat, holding a lantern high. "Drop the knife, Mason!" a voice boomed. It was the town sheriff. Drawn by the sounds of the gunshots, he had ridden out through the storm. Silas's eyes lit up with renewed hope. "Sheriff! Thank God! Arrest him! He's a crazy murderer!" But the sheriff wasn't looking at Caleb. He was looking at Silas, his face grim. And behind him, another figure emerged from the storm. Grace's father. His face was pale and drawn, but his eyes were resolute. "He's the one, Sheriff," Grace's father said, his voice shaking but clear. "I heard him. I heard the whole thing." He had followed the sheriff, worried for his daughter. He had heard Silas's confession. Justice, after so many years, had finally arrived in the heart of the storm. The aftermath was a blur. The sheriff arrested Silas and his wounded accomplice. Grace's father rushed to her, pulling her into a fierce, trembling hug, murmuring apologies she barely heard. But Grace's eyes were on Caleb. He stood by the hearth, his body battered, his clothes torn, staring at the flames. The fight was over. The war that had defined his entire life had come to an end. But he didn't look victorious. He just looked empty. The rage that had fueled him for so long was gone, and she didn't know what was left in its place. In the weeks that followed, the story spread through the town like a spring thaw. The tale of the fire, Silas's confession, the siege at the cabin. The whispers that had once condemned Grace now praised her. She and Caleb were no longer outcasts. They were heroes. But the town's approval meant nothing to them. They retreated to the cabin, to the quiet solitude of the woods, to lick their wounds and figure out what came next. The cabin was damaged, scarred by the fight, but they worked together to repair it. They replaced the splintered door, patched the bullet holes in the walls. With every nail hammered, every board replaced, it felt like they were not just rebuilding the cabin, but rebuilding themselves. The emptiness in Caleb's eyes began to fade, replaced by a quiet peace Grace had never seen before. The ghosts of his past had been exorcised, not by vengeance, but by truth. Spring arrived in full force. The forest came alive with color and birdsong. Grace's small garden began to sprout, tiny green shoots pushing their way through the dark earth, full of promise. The world felt new again. One evening, as the sun set, painting the sky in brilliant strokes of orange and pink, Caleb found her by the garden. He was holding something in his hand. It was a small wooden carving, whittled from a piece of pine. A figure of a man and a woman, standing side by side, their hands almost touching. "It's us," he said, his voice quiet. He placed it in her hand. The wood was smooth and warm from his touch. Grace's throat felt tight with emotion. She looked up at him, at this man who had been her stranger, her captor, her protector, her husband. In his eyes, she saw not the haunted survivor, but a man looking toward the future. His future. Their future. "Thank you, Caleb," she whispered. He reached out, not with the rough grip of a rescuer, but with a gentle hand that cupped her face. "No, Grace," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer tried to hide. "Thank you. You saved me. You brought me back to life." He leaned down and kissed her, a soft, hesitant kiss that held all the unspoken words, all the shared pain, and all the hope of a new beginning. They were two broken people, thrown together by a storm, who had found a way to heal each other. Their life wasn't what either of them had planned, but standing there, in the quiet of the wilderness that was now their home, they knew it was exactly where they were meant to be. Their story is a powerful reminder that sometimes the greatest storms bring the most unexpected peace. What do you think is the most important part of their journey? The survival, the justice, or the love they found? Let us know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more.